Hello, Patricia here, welcoming you to the Poetry Pcast. As you know, I often have guests on the podcast to give readings, to join me as community judges for the various topics we write on, and of course, to give us workshops, to help us with our short form poetry. But today I want to bring you something a little different. I want to bring you a conversation between two poets I call the philosopher poets. One of whom we know very well, Sean O'Connor, and another whose voice we've not heard before, but we're definitely familiar with his work, Thomas Festa, who's a professor of English at the State University of New York. I'll put their details in the show notes so you can follow them up at your leisure. Now you might be asking yourself, what's the point? What is Patricia hoping to achieve? If you're a regular here, you'll know how passionate I am about my short form poetry. I'd say by now I'm probably on solid ground calling myself an expert in haiku, with a good working knowledge of other short forms, like senryu, one-line poetry, tanka, and haibun. You'll also know that I want to spread my passion for the genre, and hopefully the work myself and the team do here at P Towers does that, and our passion shines through. You'll know that when I study a topic, I try and read as many academic sources as possible, supplementing that with poetry from the ancients through to the modern. In doing this, I've noticed that there's a paucity of serious academic work being done in the English language about Japanese short forms. And you've often heard me rail against the teaching of haiku in schools as more of an exercise in syllable counting than in poetry. In the last couple of years, I've written substantial essays to accompany podcasts, essays which would probably not find a home in the various short-form publications because they're just too long and don't fit that submission criteria. I will, however, be putting them together and publishing them via Poetry P Press in due course. Anyway, that aside, I wanted to find supplementary ways of creating conversations about our beloved form, and Sean came up with an idea. That idea became this podcast, which is an introduction to something that the three of us want to take further as a short series of podcasts this year on topics around the short form. In this podcast, I ask the two gentlemen to think what role history plays in the short form. As you're going to hear, they range through many topics, some of which were on our list to come back to, some not. Now, I'll repeat this plea at the end of the podcast, but what I'd like you to do is write to me, email me, tell me which of the topics they spoke of you would like them to discuss in greater detail. Once we have that list, we'll get cracking, creating the content for you, and those of you who are members will get an invite to the recording so you can ask questions of Sean and Thomas. Can you do that for me, please? Email me your thoughts. So without further ado, let's go and meet the lads and hear what they have to say. Thank you both very much for joining me. I'm going to hand it over to you now. Off you go.
Tom, we've had this task that we both know we're going to talk with history in the context, I suppose, as well, of with Japanese so-called short forms. So the haibun can be very long. So what are your own thoughts on this over the past few days?
Well, I've been thinking about how awareness of form and awareness of the history of form can be a productive matrix for exploring creative thought, and how rather than seeing the constraint that knowledge of the past will impose as negative or some kind of imposition, it can rather be a liberating force and give a kind of momentum to the creative process. I've been thinking about how, in a way, the approach that I made to haiku and haibun was by means of Basho and 17th century Japanese literature. So my personal approach was to come at it as a student of the literature and then to explore its possibility today. But it's worth saying I wasn't convinced of the potential of haibun until I encountered your work, Sean. So I would say I come at it by way of the history first, and I was writing lyric poetry in Western modes with an interest in haiku, but I wasn't convinced of the viability. And to be fair, a Japanese literature scholar colleague of mine has told me that haibun is not, generally speaking, as commonly practiced today in Japan as it is in the English-speaking world.
That would be true. Although it might not be. It also may not be, but it would appear to be. Well, what I want to ask you though is, has your sense of the history of the form, if you like, or the canon, that you started with the canon, you started with Basho, who was the originator, if you like, of what we can now call the canon, because technically speaking, although the haiku existed before Basho, the point of Basho's intervention with his colleagues, he wasn't alone in this. There was a scene, if you like, of writers. They developed the haiku, which is still referred to as the haiku, into the haiku, an independent verse. This was their contribution, if you like. They separated it out from the renge. But as a matter of interest, because this has been my experience, I'm answering the question for myself first. My experience has been that I started with that, and then it, over many years, began to realize that what we had understood to be the case wasn't the case. Did you also find that, your sense of, or what people, the readers you were engaging with, and what you were reading, and the literature you're reading, later turned out to be maybe not so grounded or solid? Because that's what happened to me, and I'm happy to elaborate on that.
I think that is exactly right. There are many different tendrils of argument entwined in that particular braid. But let's say, for instance, the 575 controversy, is it? I don't know. And I think that the idea that the Japanese language has a different measure from the English syllabic measure has been used in a way that is not historical. So in a way, sure, 575 in syllables is not an exact analogy, but it is an analogy. And if we're talking about the history of the form and we're talking about rhythm, there's an argument to be made that haiku is not 575 and never really was. It's also not 575.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be many different things, and it always was, but it's something to do with the way of thinking about the history of form, which is true in Western poetry. It's true of the sonnet. It's true of any received form. And of course, there's a whole intellectual freight to any conversation about form. There's a whole set of philosophical and we could say spiritual predispositions or conceptions in play. But I think just to keep it relatively contained, I'd say that the conversation about 575 is dispiriting in part because I think that the practice in contemporary haiku writing in English has been sort of imported from an attitude toward form in contemporary poetic writing in Western styles. So a kind of contemporary Western attitude has been applied to an Eastern form. So the rejection of set form in Western poetry and free verse has led to a kind of misconception about the nature of the Japanese form. And so what's being rejected is a Western conception of form rather than the Eastern practice.
So when it comes to the practice, we had quite some surprises over the years. When I was editing the print journal Haiku Spirit back in the late 90s, we were full sure that we knew what we were doing. And we had very clear sense that a haiku was a three-line poem. But however, there was always this idea it could be one, two, three, four. There was no appreciation of any sense of a structured rhythm at all, none whatsoever, which is the basis of 575 syllables. That is the point of 575. It's an indication of rhythm. So when people say no, it's not 575, the next question I have is, well, what is it then? What is it? So we had this weird experience where for many years we were dwelling in we were printing concrete poems as haiku, which they're not. I was doing this as editor. I was doing it. Then we were printing minimalist poems, which are really very tentative, if any connection to haiku at all, except that they were minimal. That seemed to be the only qualification. And after some time, then Professor Sharani in Columbia University he came out and he kind of just smashed apart a lot of misconceptions we had. My favorite one is Busan. Busan wrote a haiku about feeling the cold of his dead wife's comb when he gets out of bed at night. He steps on the comb of his dead wife. And Shirani pointed out that Westerners, myself included, believed that haiku could not be contrived, or should not be contrived at least. And there we have this guy, Busan, writing about stepping on his dead wife's comb, only to discover his wife died many years after he did. So it was a riveting example of how wrong we were, just with one single haiku. Then on top of that, we then there was always this sense of it's a Zen thing or it's not a Zen thing. That was a big argument for a while. And people were cherishing the connection with Zen and other people were rejecting it completely. I ended up living for 5 years in Japan and realizing that, Zen wasn't the main sport at all and never really has been. And that a lot of what was spoken about it in relation to its culture was very dubious. So suddenly I'm confronted with a completely different sense of, if I dare I say it, facts. Facts. And it's as though the world entered, a group of people entered into this other literary culture and just didn't check the basics or didn't ask the question, how do they do this?
Well, I was just thinking in relation to this that there is a very strong historical argument against the idea that haiku has to be nonfiction, shall we say. I was thinking particularly about the haiku primer of Okanishi Ichu from 1675, in which, and this is from the early modern Japanese literature anthology that Shirane edited, he says that the model really is the carefree wandering of the Chuangzi, and that spontaneity and change and a mixture of real and unreal are the very lifeblood of haikai writing. That carefree wandering, or sort of process as discovery, is the idea, and that there should be a mixture, a combination. By its very nature, haikai writing is mixed, is hybridic. It isn't singular. And your example from Busan is perfect. It seems to me this is equally true, as we know from Basho's Haibun. We have lists of Utamakura, of poetic places that he intended to visit. And we have a at times contradictory account of the places they visited from his travel companion. So we know that he was fictionalizing as he wrote. He was writing, and he was doing what writers do. He was amending and shaping. It wasn't simply a matter of reportage. Sometimes one has the sense, because it's travel literature, that it's nonfiction, or that, I mean, I'm tempted to say that whole dualistic conception of fiction and nonfiction is misplaced, is a kind of linear and dualistic way of thinking that doesn't really pertain to the practice.
And the subject of his great work, the often referred to as the narrow road to the deep north, is contained in its opening line, which roughly says the months and days are the travelers of eternity. And it's eternity that is at the very core of the entire piece. So you can't get a grander subject than pretty much everything.
Right, right. But also, of course, it's framed in this in literary context by the fact that that's an allusion to Li Bo. And indeed, the idea of the poignancy of impermanence that runs throughout the work depends upon the historical sense. So it's not spiritual in the sense of Western metaphysics. It's not the phenomenal world, or not factual, but it's also not sort of hidebound in its idea of the fact, right? It's the fact includes what I think in Soto Zen would be called the absolute. Not
Exactly.
just
Can
And
I
there's a
ask, can I butt in with a
Sure.
question here? The problem we have when translating the facts to a Western audience, if you like, is the language and translation. How can we be sure of the facts? Who do we trust? I guess.
Could I say something on that? I actually think the language obstacle is not the main obstacle. I
Okay.
think the main obstacle is the approach that's taken. The approach that's taken that concerns me is a lack of concern about what this all is. So I'll give you an example from the tanka writing. A tanka is not a 5-line poem. But when you read tanka written in English, that's what you're going to get. All kinds of variations of 5-line poems. The basic question of what is the structure of this tanka, which is the same as a waka, and it's worth mentioning, according to Gabriel Rosenstock, and I think he might be right about this, the waka or tanka is a form of poetry that has been consistently written for longer than any other form, as in with no breaks in history. And its structure and its approach has not changed essentially all of that time, over hundreds of years, over more than 1,000 years. The upper verse, the lower verse, the basics I'm talking about, have not been altered, except when they were transposed into English, in which case everything was abandoned. So why was it abandoned? And I think the abandonment came from a lack of concern about what this really is. In the same way as I think there's an abandonment, there's no effort to talk about haiku other than haiku as a word, which now in English means pretty much any form of minimalist poetry or short poetry. It's a shorthand word. So at the very beginning, we got the word wrong. We've literally got the fact of what a haiku is. The fact is, it is not simply a minimalist form. It is not any type of short poem. It is a very specific type of short poem. In that sense, I'm not keen on overbearing on the word facts, but that is a fact. So it's the carelessness that comes from, I think, from a society in the West that Scheffler is pointing out has kind of abandoned a sense of longitudinal history or any sense of future or past. I think it's contained in Scheffler's work, the answer to this what he calls temporal parochialism, where we have a narrow view of time and a lack of concern about the past, because this happened in the past. This, in other words, when haiku came to America, it came to America as something that had no past, if you like, or nobody investigated that past in a very thorough way. So all of that was just blanked out or has become irrelevant. Or do you see what I mean? Do you see what I'm trying to say? It's a deeper question than just the language.
And I think the issue of translation is always going to be essential to any kind of literary expression, because of course we can speak more abstractly of writing itself as a translation of experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the translation of the inner logic of form is a much deeper problem. And I think the issue of rhythm, for instance, it doesn't really matter which language we're talking about. Of course, it might be rendered a more extreme problem with Asian languages, but the same is true of trying to translate Dante into English. How do you do it? If you try to translate it as terza rima, it makes a hash of it. You can't do it. It doesn't really work. Now, I guess I would say, as an English reader, one can read Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ode to the West Wind and experience terza rima beautifully written. And that might be a closer analogy for the English reader than a translation of Dante. You see, but the idea that you're going to maintain the form exactly in a different language system, even in a language with different rhythms, is not possible. So, Patricia, for instance, when you had your issue, your podcast on Tonka, and you spoke of long and short and long and the kind of division within the Tonka, that carried the spirit, and it didn't adhere to the kind of simplistic letter of the form. And I think that is a way to think about translation, where you have the spirit of the thing, you have the inner logic of the form maintained, but you don't pretend that you can exactly mime the effect of the form in a totally different language. That just doesn't work. That doesn't even work from one Germanic language to another, never mind within different European language groups or within languages as different as Asian languages and European.
If you look at the case of rhythm, something I'm very keen on, rhythm is a defining feature of poetry. It's what sets it apart by definition from prose. And prose does not require never did, or a consistent rhythm. It can be rhythmic, but it's not required. Poetry, it's an essential feature of poetry. And if haiku are to deserve the term poetry, they need to have a sense of rhythm. But once people abandoned 575, they abandoned the idea of rhythm itself. And it's speaking as a musician, you're there going, rhythm to a musician is not a vague abstract idea. What the first question a musician asks you is, well, what you can't say to a musician, we'd like to play this now with good rhythm. They go, yes, but what's the time signature? It's only when the musicians know the time signature that you can progress. And haiku has a time signature, just like sonnets do, and iambic pentameter in English, they're time signatures. But people have said, well, the time signature isn't working because of the language, so we'll have no time signature. That's what we ended up with.
Exactly. It's as though the response were, well, that's metronomic and boring. And so you reject the notion of rhythm because you have an oversimplification of it to begin with.
And then when someone turns around and says, well, look, the point of 575 is not simply a syllable count, it's also an indication of 3 utterances. And that there is a caesura at the end of each of the lines. They would also say at the end, no full stop. It ends with a kind of an ellipsis. Once you hear this from the Japanese, which I did when I lived there, it all became completely different. It was a whole different animal opened up. Now we're starting to see a form emerging. And the second thing with Kigo are not about seasonality as such, not in the dry way that we often think of it. Kigo are about emotional resonance and using references to seasonality for the generation of emotional resonance. This makes the Kigo an incredibly strong literary device, not simply a requirement to mention the weather.
I think it's important to add that this was a component of Japanese literature before haiku, that
Long before.
Kenko's Essays in Idleness, for instance, there's a very strong emphasis on the changing of seasons as the most poignant experience a human being can have, as the essence of affect. So it was present before haiku. It's present in waka. You can see it in Japanese culture long before the haiku separated from the ranga.
You can also see it certainly in Irish literature going back to the beginnings of Irish literature, and even contemporary writers. I know he's dead now, but John McGahern from our favourite place in Ireland, Leitrim, myself and Patricia's favourite place. His opening is about the bells, the mass bells echoing across the calm lake. The world was still, and all that kind of stuff. Stunning and persistent references to the changing of seasons in order to keep an emotional connection with the reader. And people will read that who've never been to Leitrim, never been to Ireland, never lived in this kind of climate, and who will be, I would guess, living in a country that doesn't exist today in 200 years' time, and it'll still resonate. It'll still resonate. But this is, and so that aspect of Japanese literature and haiku writing in particular has been kind of overlooked almost, or not understood. And therefore people don't value it. And they say, well, you don't really need a kigo. It doesn't matter. But in fact, if I get back to that, one of the shocks I had in Japan was I went to Japan with the notion that you don't really need to use a kigo. And we were always happy to publish without a kigo. And suddenly I'm confronted with a nation of people who all uniformly say, oh, sorry, no kigo, no haiku. Just end off, no discussion about it. Otherwise you're writing senryu, or you're writing this, you're writing that. And so at the end of the day, there are boundaries. There are definitions, there are places that beyond which we have gone somewhere else. And I'm a bit puzzled as to why people don't satisfy themselves with saying, I chose to write a 3-line poem. I chose not to use kigo. That's fine, that's a choice. So, for example, it's a senryu, which is a different thing. And just be clear. Or it's just a tercet. Or it's something else. But why people insist on expanding the umbrella of what they're referring to as haiku, the danger of that is then we lose what's at the essence of this form, and we start then to devalue its techniques. And that's where the power is in the work. The power is in this incredible ability to emotionally resonate with readers through this literary device, which is a hard-won thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to achieve. And difficulty, by the way, is another issue. I think not enough people are willing to spend the time to get this really working because it's so hard. It takes a long time. But anyway, sorry, Tom, I'll let you get back in there because I'm sure you have a few things to say at that.
I do, but, one thing that comes to mind is that how we relate to nature is of the essence in this conversation. And I think that sometimes people think of kigo and they think of sajiki and they think of formularies and they think that it's pat. But I think in the description of the natural world, in our intimate relation to the natural world, we can find means of expression that are not pat, that are not simply, plugging in some received form, but thinking of form as not as something that you fill out, but as something that you discover.
Mm-hmm. See, the other point is that in all technique in art, most artists get it badly, wrong. Most artists fail. Most art doesn't make the gallery. Most painting doesn't make the gallery. Most writing doesn't get published. Let's start off with some basics here. So there are no shortcuts. If there's one message I have for anybody that is interested in any form of art is, it takes a long time. There are no shortcuts. This is something T.S. Eliot mentions rather well in that essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he said, this all takes work. It takes a lot of work. And you do need to be erudite. And there's no way around that. And I think that sometimes if something is proving to be difficult, there's a tendency to want to abandon it in favor of an easier route. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just thinking that if we spin the telescope round and look at it differently, I was thinking of the title of Ken Jones' Haibun from Arrows of Stone. There is no time. What is memory? It's something that he quotes from the arch, the entryway of a monastery in in Hong Kong. And I was thinking, there is no time. What is memory? If there is no time, then what memory is perception. It's present. It's the presence of the past. And this is what Basho calls traces of memory. It's the presence of the past, the awareness that it exists in our moment. I think that's a kind of directedness toward perception that haiku writers, haibun writers, kanko writers can all benefit from, because it's not as though the past isn't present. Right. So it's the hottest topic. It's the most relevant. It's exactly where we are.
Yet we have people today constantly saying, I don't read literature because I don't want it to influence my writing. Have you heard that being said to you?
Oh, yeah.
That's a common statement. Have you heard that, Tom, before? People say, "No, no, I don't want to read other writers because they will influence my work." Have you heard that said?
Yeah, that makes me think of Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence, and the notion that, we're constantly involved in a kind of an agonistic struggle with the past. So we rewrite or misread our precursors, but you do have to read to misread.
Exactly, in the first place. So for me, I do think that at the heart of this, it does come down to matters of practicalities, as does everything I've ever experienced in Zen, I would have to say, comes down to eyes horizontal, nose vertical, which is the statement of Dogen when he came back from what did you learn after 4 years in China?
Mm.
Form is a physical thing. And I think maybe we might differ on this, but I think that if you get the basics wrong, if you don't grasp what has come before us and what people have been doing, and if you don't accept any boundaries, then you have nothing to show the skill or to demonstrate anything. You're in the ether. You're floating around, going in any. How do I say? Billy Collins says, if you don't write to at least some sort of syllable count, he says himself, when I'm writing haiku, then I'm the subject of literary whim.
Suffice to say, we don't invent forms when we sit to write in received forms. You don't sit and with the intention to write a haiku and invent haiku. There is something in place that you're receiving. And I think in part, there's the question of how this has been received in the language in which you're writing and its tradition. And then there's what's behind that. And there's always something behind that. There's the great Chinese tradition behind the Japanese tradition. There's always something, to learn.
My difficulty is I think that a large cohort of people in the West writing in English for these forms have paid at very best lip service to all of this and have basically ignored the past. That's what I think. I think
Yeah.
there's been a break with so-called tradition. I also think that at best they have invented tradition
Mhm.
in the sense of Hobsbawm and Redding's work, the invention of tradition. I think that there has been a lack of concern and really careful examination of what this is. They haven't received it, in other words.
Can I ask you another question? You've just touched on evolution from, the Chinese to the Japanese. We're taking it a step further by bringing it into the West. We're talking about English language, primarily English language haiku, because that's our common language. It is written elsewhere. We should remember that in other Western languages. We're moving things on as a English language cohort. How can we stick to the form, or should we stick to a form that is recognizable, going back in the evolutionary form? Do you see developments that are not sticking to that form? And what do we do about that? Do we acknowledge that what we are writing as English language poets is no longer related back on the evolutionary trail.
There is not this homogeneous thing called Western haiku.
Mm-hmm.
I know this as editor at the Haibun Journal, we get an awful lot of Haibun submitted to us from outside the bubble, the self-proclaimed bubble
Yep.
of Haibun writers within the scene that is noted for it. And it is a self-proclaimed bubble, let's face it. I think that the answer to your question about art evolves all the time, whether it wants to or not. It's in its nature to do so. But I would take something from the language of the Japanese about how we learn any art form, which is the Shuhari approach, the 3 steps. The first step is repetition. It is repeating exactly the way it's been done for a long time. It is strictly writing to 575. It is always using the Kigo. It's learning the ropes. It's following the masters. The second stage, by the way, that Shiki advocated was then start to copy the masters, try to rewrite their work and all of that. And we're talking about recommendations of writing 5,000 haiku for each of these stages. Not 5, not 50, not 500. Shiki said the first 5,000 should be practicing the form, staying within it strictly. No attempt at artistic expression as such. Just get yourself into the mode here. Learn your steps as a dancer. Learn the brushstrokes as a painter. Get the techniques right, get it basic. Then move on to the copying the masters. Move on to then working with others to get the feedback on developing your own artistic expression. And the ultimate idea is to go beyond the form. But that takes years, decades, and it's no shortcut, and it is persistent. And if you're starting on the wrong foot, you are doomed. You're
Sean,
just doomed. It's a non-starter.
If I could interject another important writing by T.S. Eliot, his Reflections on Vers Libre, where he speaks of free verse. And the final sentence is, the sting is in the tail. He says, so it's a reflection on free verse. He speaks of having to master iambic pentameter in order skillfully to evade it.
Yeah,
and then he concludes by saying, there is no such thing as free verse. There's only good verse, bad verse, and chaos. I think that was written over 100 years ago, and it's still true. And so I think that when someone like Ezra Pound writes In the Station of the Metro, this is the first poem included in Jim Cassian's Norton Anthology of Haiku, I believe. Mm-hmm. And it's an important poem in English, and it does bring something of the haiku aesthetic into the English language in the modern world. But Pound's awareness of Asian literature and Asian languages is non-scholarly, and he's relying on other folks whose work has since been discredited. So you can look at his couplet in the Station of the Metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And you can see the kind of skeletal resemblance to a haiku. And there's much that could be said about it. And it is an important poem. And we might even be willing to grant it a consideration as haiku. But it's not really the progenitor of a tradition. It doesn't really bring the tradition forward. It just it's a little glimpse. It's a little window. And so I think, the idea that you have to know the tradition in order to evade it might be a way to think about progress or evolution, to think that probably, and again, this is Eliot and tradition and the individual talent, the most radical move you can make would be to go way, way back, go back to much, much earlier sources. You're sure to discover radical aesthetic innovation that people would not be expecting now if you go backwards.
Exactly. Yeah. Does that make sense to you, Patricia?
It does, and I think that's probably a very good place to stop now.
Thank you for having us.
Phew, that was some discussion, wasn't it? I'll put lots of links for you in the show notes. If I've missed anything, just tell me, and please don't forget to email me with your thoughts on topics you'd like to hear more about. Thank you so much to Thomas and Sean, and to you, of course, for coming along to listen today. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, write to me about the discussion you've heard today. Your thoughts are vital going forward. Submit. Submit to whatever we've got open at the time you're listening to this. There'll almost certainly be a video prompt on the Poetry P YouTube channel. For that one, you need to put your poems in the comments, please. Don't send them to me. And think about supporting the podcast with a membership, a coffee, or by buying one of Poetry P Press's publications. Most importantly, join me next week for more poetry. Until then, keep writing. And don't forget to check the links in the podcast. The table next to my reading chair is swamped thanks to these two chaps. Ciao!